Hello and good morning, Greg. Welcome.
Good morning, Kelly. Thanks very much for having me.
I'm grateful to have this opportunity to talk with you. It's such an important topic. Thanks for being here. So, Greg, just by way of introduction, sorry?
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Greg, just by way of introduction, I know you're aware, but I'm a psychologist. However, prior to becoming a psychologist, I was a police lady for 13 years. I specialized in sex crimes committed against children. And in that career, I became aware that boys and men are victims far more commonly than most people think. So this brings me to you and your story, Greg, and I believe it's really important for people to be able to understand who perhaps your typical victim might be and how perpetrators get to their victims. I think there's still this sort of illusion that perpetrators are this proverbial stranger in the white van waiting to abduct a child. And of course, we know better than that. We know that 90% of sexual abuse is perpetrated by someone that the victim knows and cares for. So, Greg, can you please share with us how Graham James won you over, won your trust, and perhaps just maybe some of the confusion that you felt?
Sure. And I think you've hit upon a very important point right at the outset. The whole concept of stranger danger sort of sits out there, the evil perpetrator lurking in the shadows. And well, that happens. That's the vast minority of cases. These crimes are crimes based upon misplaced trust of an evil perpetrator winning over and grooming a potential victim, and they are, as you say, in the vast majority of cases, people known, either family members or people very close to the victim. Graham James was a very prominent hockey coach in Winnipeg, where I grew up. He never directly coached me, but he targeted me very early on. I was a high-profile, successful athlete. I was a student who skipped grade. I was a giant of a child. I'm well over 6.5 feet tall now. I was a physical specimen back then who with one punch could have destroyed Graham, yet he was able to get to me. And that's the thing. Perpetrators access their victims not through physical dominance in most cases, but it's a mental game of entrapment, of grooming, of making, in Graham's case, Graham made my world his and his world mine. And he cut me off from all contacts with anyone who could have helped me. He led me to see the world through his eyes. He approached me holding out a candle of potential hockey success. Yet at the same time, he was able to figure out quite quickly that I had a weak bond within my family, that I was emotionally distant from my father. And so he stepped in and took that role. And I was a very good hockey player, so he stepped in as the potential hockey mentor. He figured out me, he groomed me, and he dragged me along until by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. He'd already accessed me physically. And by that point, by the time I mentally figured out what was going on, I didn't believe that anyone would believe me. And it was in many ways too late. And so I was trapped.
And Greg, you hit on a lot of the points that I discovered in my research, which was in regards to why boys and men don't commonly disclose. And that was a lot about the relationship that was established, right? So there's this trust that's won over by the victim. And, I know from my own research that perpetrators go to extensive lengths to be thought of as like the least likely person you'd ever suspect to abuse you. And that, they do try to fill that void, and they do purposely try to leave you confused. That relationship is well established prior to the sexual part beginning.
Yeah, it's not as if Graham decided one day he was going to sexually abuse me and then started abusing me the next day. Graham had to craft a world and get at me and provide himself cover so that things that maybe would have been offside at first instance seemed reasonable by the time he was using them to take advantage of me. Graham would hang around hockey rinks to scout. And what that meant was Graham was not only a coach, but his job was literally to watch other young boys play hockey, to make connections with them and to suss out their future interests to see whether or not he could attract them to the junior team he was representing at the time. Graham was volunteering with other teams on the surface to But if you peel that away, and with 2020 hindsight, we look back at what Graham was doing. He was putting himself in a position where he could literally stare at boys, find out about young boys, and target young boys. And the interesting thing about Graham is he wasn't just a hockey coach. He was a substitute teacher doing exactly the same thing within the school system. Graham was giving himself as many shots as possible at finding out who he could potentially victimize. And to provide cover for that, he layered in the I'm a hockey scout, I'm a hockey coach, I'm a school teacher. At base, Graham was a sexual predator, nothing more, nothing less.
So great examples of how he went to such extensive lengths to put himself in an environment where he would have access to children. Can you tell us just a little bit more, Greg, about sort of this dual identity that he would have had, like his facade that he maintained in public versus how he was with you in private?
Sure. And the fascinating thing about Graham is when you see pictures of him in the news, knowing that he's a serial child sexual predator, you see a picture of Graham and you go, oh, there's a serial child sexual predator. It's obvious. But because of the myth that Graham built up around himself, he was a god in my part of the world, in my part of Winnipeg. He was a successful hockey coach. He built himself up as being intensely connected within the hockey world. And so anyone who was involved in hockey, be it a child or a parent, wanted to do nothing but impress Graham James. And when you look at Graham James and you peel this all back, the last word that would ever come to your mind with respect to Graham is impressive. But Graham was utterly dependent upon building up a facade, a fake persona as to who he was and what he was out to do. And it's interesting, when you're in the hockey world and you present yourself as a scout with the ability to make or break people's careers, people bow down to people with that type of power. It's ridiculous. And it's effectively, limited power at best in the bigger world, but it is what it is within living. And so within that world, he was literally a god. He was a hockey god, and that's unfortunate.
I'm just listening to you share about how many different roles that he played in your world, though, right? You said he stepped up to be sort of a father figure. He was also, I know from reading your book, he was also like personally coaching you with athletics, had you doing certain exercises. And then he also sort of held this carrot about, this idea that he was the connection for you to possibly get scouted.
Yeah, and to do that, Graham had to play different people differently. I mean, Graham has abused an awful lot of young boys. I mean, we know who has come forward. We know the numbers that have come forward. But in Graham's last parole hearing, he admitted to having sexual intercourse with approximately 20 young men. And 20 of us haven't yet. But Graham had to play each of us differently. I was never going to play junior hockey, and Graham was a junior coach. And so what Graham figured out very quickly was it wasn't to push junior hockey on me. It was to seize upon my desire to play university hockey in the States. I ended up going to Princeton and not playing varsity hockey because of what was going on. But Graham figured out that he had to approach me differently. And so he played himself up as the learned hockey man, the intellectual within the hockey world, the person who understood me as an athlete and academic. I'm certain he wasn't playing up academics with some of the other victims who have come forward yet. He had to play them very differently. But when you bring academics into it, I like to describe Graham as being the Rhodes Scholar of child sexual predators. He knew at a fundamental level the buttons he had to push and the strings he had to pull to access his victims. And so in me, he sussed out very quickly that I wasn't intellectually fulfilled, and so he offered access to better academics, an Ivy League education, an Ivy League route to the rest of the world, combined with my athletics. He figured out quickly that I had a father who dropped out of school at grade 8, and so he used that against my dad and against me to position himself as the learned university graduate in the hockey world. It was all fake. Graham hadn't graduated from university, even though he finessed his way into a teaching position. Graham was no academic. Graham was a sexual predator who would say anything that was needed to access his victims.
A true psychopath. I didn't know that part, that he was not actually a university graduate. He also Sorry.
Graham got his university degree while in jail after having been convicted the first time. That's the utter sadness of this all is Graham eventually became the man he always wanted to, only after he'd abused, numerous children.
And Greg, yeah, thanks for sharing that. I know from reading your book that you were very tormented about the idea of coming forward. Tell us a little bit about your journey towards where you are now, towards getting that courage to come forward and talk about this.
It's interesting because when I was accepted to Princeton University, that was my ticket out of Winnipeg and physically away from Graham James. And so I thought that in fleeing Winnipeg, I would be able to start over. I would be able to start the life I was supposed to be leading. But what I found out the day that I got to Princeton was that he was always going to be with me in my mind. And I became my own worst abuser. And that's the about sexual abuse. In most, not all, but in most cases, I, as a victim and other victims, carry with us of failure, of it must be our fault. We must be broken in some way. What did he see in me that led him to think that I was weak enough that I would let him do this to me? How could I be so stupid? I'm fake. I'm a fraud. I'm not worthy of any success. Princeton, look at this. I don't deserve this. If you only knew, that type of stuff. And that plays over and over and over in the head for year after year after year. And so I was able to fake it. I was able to, get through Princeton, get to law school at University of Toronto, become a lawyer, practice internationally. If you look at my resume, I'm nothing but a success. But at each and every step along the way, a complete and utter failure and fraud. And eventually you get to the point where you can't live with yourself anymore. And I mean that literally. And so it was only after a number of low points in my life, and low points is clearly an understatement. I mean, you get to a point where you're literally looking life in the face, and you're either going to live or you're not going to go on anymore. And I realized that I wanted to continue going on.
I'm so glad you did. Greg, it broke my heart reading your book about, just the self-condemnation, just the way you sabotaged your own success and didn't ask for your own needs to be met, even though people were willing to meet those needs back in the day. And yeah, so I'm very happy to hear that you did choose to come forward and get the help that you needed. It's very common that men will get to that point, boys and men will get to that point where it's either going to be, I'm either going to kill myself or talk about it. And I think, one of the reasons is boys and men don't talk about things that they don't hear other boys and men talking about. So you doing this is, I'm sure, a huge help to other male victims out there. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks. I think you're right in that there exists a stigma. Look, sexual assault of all forms against all victims carries with it an ongoing stigma, and it's no fault of the victim, but the victim does feel irrationally him or herself. The more people are talking about things, the better. Absolutely. The fundamental difficulty in getting to the point where you're going to seek help is you have to get to a very bad point. At least before there and the destigmatization process took place, you really had to get to a point where you were going to confront something you thought nobody would understand. And the funny thing is, everyone wants to help. I mean, the minute you come forward, it's not like you're shunned. You're virtually universally helped. People are good. The vast majority of human beings on this planet are wonderful. Graham and other child sexual predators are an infinitesimally small minority of the people. But that's not the reality we live, because we've experienced the assault.
And he surrounded you, right? Everywhere you looked, he was.
Oh, I'd watch hockey games. I found out he was living in Montreal, and I'd watch a Montreal Canadiens hockey game on TV. And I'd be watching the game, and then I'd realize, oh, Graham could be at the rink watching. And your mind just goes to bizarre, dark places that are completely irrational. But you can't control your mind like that. It goes where it goes.
And Greg, just in closing here, just final discussion points here. What would have helped you, kind of thing, and what would you recommend, what needs to take place? Like, I recommend parents, for example, have open discussions with their children about the fact that not everyone is safe, about things like grooming, telling children about safe touch and how to handle it in that moment if someone tries to touch them in a sexual manner, and how to handle it afterwards. What do you think will be important also for people to know?
I think there are a couple of things. I think first off, you've hit upon a big point. To the extent there can be open dialogue or the awareness of an open, receptive child, athlete, student, whatever, that if something wrong is going on, there's a to talk to somebody. That's a good thing. I mean, I was abused 4 decades ago, and this wasn't remotely on the radar. And it was a time when people wouldn't talk about absolutely anything to do with sexual assault or sexual abuse. I think it's wonderful that it's on the radar now. And that doesn't guarantee that someone who is in a difficult situation will access the resource, but having the resource is certainly better than not having the resource. At a second, even more fundamental level, I think there's been a change within society where people stick their noses in when they suspect that something may be wrong. And the biggest message I have for people out there is absolutely trust your gut. If you see an adult in any way interacting with a child in any way that remotely seems inappropriate, stick your nose in, make that adult aware that you're being watched, because any adult who is involved with children will understand in an instant why you're listening to your gut and sticking your nose in. If they are there for the best interest of the children, they will welcome the intrusion. If they are not there for the best interest of the children, but are there for their own nefarious purposes, those are the people who you will offend. Never fear offending someone who's not there for the right reason.
That's such a good point, Greg, because an adult stepping in could be the reason that a perpetrator leaves a child alone because they want easy targets. They do not want to get caught. So that's such a great point that you share. Greg, I reiterate, I know you struggled greatly to come forward, but you're doing it now. And there are still, unfortunately, thousands and thousands of men out there, even in Canada, that have been abused, that will gain courage from hearing your voice, from coming forward. And so I thank you for that. And I just wish you much healing and continued courage.
Well, thanks very much, Kelly. And thanks for taking me through this. It's not talk about this, and you've made it an okay experience.
Thank you. It's an honor.